Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and all dear students. Today we have a distinguished lecture by Ambassador T.P. Srinivasan. He's a well-known personality in the academic circles as well as in the diplomatic circles. He has also delivered lectures to the department in previous years as well. This particular lecture we thought was essential from the perspective of the strategy and negotiations in India's foreign policy itself. We have a course on strategy and negotiation in international relations, which is for the third semester, and as part of the course as well. And then as part of foreign policy, this is also helpful to look at how India tries to negotiate, what are the styles, and no better person than Ambassador T.P. Srinivasan. Let me take this privilege to introduce Ambassador T.P. Srinivasan, a former ambassador and permanent representative of India to the United Nations, Vienna, and governor of India of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Vienna, and ambassador to Austria and Slovenia between 2000 to 2004. T.P. Srinivasan has served in the Indian Foreign Service for 37 years. His previous postings were as Deputy Chief of Mission, ambassadorial rank in the Embassy of India, Washington, between 97 to 2000. High Commissioner of India to Kenya and Permanent Representative of the India to the United Nations in Nairobi, which is 95 to 97. Ambassador and Deputy Permanent Representative of India to the United Nations, New York, 1992 to 95, and Ambassador to Fiji and 8 other South Pacific island states between 1986 to 1989. He has also served in New Delhi, Tokyo, Thimphu, Moscow, New York, and Yangon. He rose to the highest level in the Indian Foreign Service in 2001 and retired in 2004. Ambassador Srinivasan has nearly 20 years of experience in multilateral diplomacy and has represented India at a number of international conferences organized by the United Nations and Commonwealth and non-aligned movement. He has chaired several UN committees and conferences. Ambassador Srinivasan has a creditable academic record, having stood first in the University of Kerala in BA English and MA English. He has won several distinctions during his student days. He speaks Japanese and Russian. Ambassador Srinivasan was the Executive Director of the IAEA 2020, a project launched by the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Vienna. He was a member of the National Security Advisory Board of the Government of India from 2009 to 2012. He was the Vice Chairman and Executive Head of the Kerala State Higher Education Council with the rank of Vice Chancellor. He is presently the Chairman of Academic Council and Director of the NSS Civil Service Academy and Director General Kerala International Center. He also contributes articles regularly to Indian and foreign publications such as Asia, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, The Hindu, The Times of India, Open Magazine, Sunday Guardian, Rediff.com, Manorama Online, Manipal University's web portal, that is STS Sport, Malayalam Manorama, Mathrubhumi, and many others. He is a visiting professor of international relations and chair of the Center for Diaspora Studies at the Central University of Kerala, Kasaragod. Ambassador Srinivasan was a visiting fellow on foreign policy at the Brookings Institution, Washington in 2009. He is the author of 7 books: Words, Adventures in Diplomacy, Encounters, Mattering to India, Applied Diplomacy Through the Prism of Mythology, Education of an Ambassador, Venkat Forever, and Modi Diplomacy. In fact, Venkat Forever was the one which I discussed with you people regarding former Ambassador Venkateshwaran. Mr. Srinivasan is married to Lekha Srinivasan, who is also an Indian classical dancer and painter. His prizes and awards include Professor M.P. Paul Prize, the Harvey Memorial Prize, Panikkar Memorial Award, Sri Chitra Tirunal National Award, KPS Menon Award, and the Asianet News Award for completing 600 episodes of Videsha Vicharam, where he speaks about foreign policy with different individuals, and on a regular basis he educates the public of Kerala in a language that they can understand. He doesn't speak like a diplomat, but he tries making diplomacy easy and accessible to each individual who watches these televisions. There are so many other things. I don't think I can even end by introducing him to you people. So it's an extreme honor and a privilege to have you with us on behalf of the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations. Manipal Academy of Higher Education, a very, very warm welcome, and over to you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anand Kishore, members of the faculty of your department, students of Manipal Academy of Higher Education, and distinguished listeners in the university as well as around the globe. I am grateful to the Manipal Academy of Higher Education for inviting me to a distinguished lecture on India's negotiating style and strategy in international negotiations. Even after a lifetime of bilateral and multilateral negotiations in diverse topics in different lands and multiple fora, it's a challenge to describe an Indian style and strategy in international negotiations, as there is no single style or strategy suitable for all negotiations. I do not recall having received any technical training in the art of negotiations or strategy as part of the preparation for a diplomatic career. It was a continuous process of learning, innovation, and invention as situations presented themselves in different circumstances. But the existence of a strong and continuous Indian strategic culture from ancient times provided a solid basis for Indian diplomacy. The fact is that negotiations are a part of human life from beginning to end, from extracting pocket money from parents to getting a decent contract for funeral arrangements. Negotiations are not a matter of choice. What matters is how well we negotiate situations to our benefit. The education, reading of history and literature, life experiences, observations, and innate wisdom go into the preparations for successful negotiations. What is true of individual lives is true of nations, and management of international relations and every situation demands a style and a strategy especially suited for the specific occasion. Perhaps the way for me is to make case studies of some of my negotiating experiences and see whether a pattern emerges. These are not from books or archives, but from ingrained memories. But first, some fundamental objectives and factors that determine the style and management of India's international relations. Indian foreign policy has always been principled but pragmatic. It has demonstrated dynamism and resilience. India has looked at the world with clear and friendly eyes. It has eschewed military alliances, expansionism, and violence. We seek mutuality of interests in bilateral relations and well-being of the global commons in multilateral fora. We have not sought to make the United Nations an instrument of our foreign policy or a place to assert our sovereignty. We have been on a quest for what we can contribute to the world rather than to extract concessions or favors from it. Long-term foreign policy planning has proved hazardous to every nation. Cataclysmic changes occur from time to time, playing havoc with well-thought-out strategies, giving way to firefighting and impromptu decisions. The global order established after the Second World War is in disarray today because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise of China, the weakening of multilateralism, and most recently, the pandemic. The strength of a nation lies in its ability to sustain its values and resilience against these challenges. India has maintained its strategic autonomy in international relations, even after adopting multiple alliances, and has created a framework to achieve a multipolar world. India has also reaffirmed our faith in a reformed multilateralism even after the failure of the United Nations to rise to the new challenges. There have been certain guidelines for our conduct of foreign policy. The negotiating process is a continuum, and good negotiations outcomes come out of good relationships cultivated over a period of time. Every bilateral or multilateral step is seen as an investment for the future, and the more IOUs we gather, the better equipped we are to negotiate successfully. Indian diplomats have certain unique strengths that good negotiators must have. Having been through one of the toughest selection processes, they have the intellectual acumen, linguistic skills in speech and writing, sharp wit and presence of mind. Their drafting skills have saved many situations in the United Nations and created seminal resolutions which have stood the test of time. Their positivity and sense of fairness and objectivity are widely recognized. Most of them have pleasant voices and pleasing body language, which are great assets during the interactions. Practice makes perfect negotiators, and Indian diplomats know that knowledge is crucial in negotiations. They research history, study the problems of the past and the situation of the other party. Strong belief in their position results in proper articulation of the case and carries conviction. Preparation also enables negotiators to anticipate outcomes and keep several options ready. Give and take is an essential part of negotiations, but we ensure that a balance is maintained between gains and concessions through the process to maintain equality. The team effort is key to good negotiations. The leader has to be supported with facts and intelligence about the reactions in the opposite camp. India has good teams and good leaders in important bilateral and multilateral missions, and that's the strength that often comes into play. This also trains the younger diplomats to rise to the occasion when their time comes to lead. To come to case studies, the most difficult diplomatic situation I witnessed was in Washington in the aftermath of our nuclear tests in 1998. Never before have diplomats of friendly countries sat around a table without having to say anything. Friends at different levels turned into strangers overnight, leaving no room for conversation, not to speak of negotiations. They took the position that India had betrayed them by shaking the fundamentals of non-proliferation, which for them was the key to world stability and peace. The only answer, according to them, was punishment by way of the most comprehensive sanctions amounting to break in political and economic relations. Our logic, put across by a master negotiator, Ambassador Naresh Chandra, fell on deaf ears. Offers of high-level bilateral talks, either in Washington or New Delhi, were firmly rejected. President Clinton kept his promise, inverted commas, to come down on these guys like a ton of bricks. Glenn Amendment sanctions were imposed when India rejected an ultimatum to sign the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and the operation of the sanctions was thoughtless and severe. Total uncertainty descended on India-US relations, including the future of the Indian community in the United States. We had no choice but to be innovative. The strong support of the Indian community was our strength, and we activated it to arrange meetings for our diplomats to explain our case as our friends on the Hill turned hostile, except for a couple of steadfast aficionados of India. The press, both international and Indian, began to carry our statements, which reached the State Department and the general public. We met as many congressmen and senators as possible, individually, even at the risk of having to hear an earful about the fall of India from grace. We virtually negotiated with the State Department, through the Indian community, the press, and the Congress. The consequences of sanctions to the US economy itself attracted the attention of some Republican senators who moved legislation independent of the State Department. Henry Kissinger, not a great friend of India in the past, publicly supported the Indian case, saying that India lives in a tough neighborhood. All this had a cumulative effect on the Clinton administration. And after 2 terrible months of a chilly winter in the summer in Washington, in India-US relations, the US agreed to open a dialogue with India through the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, Mr. Jaswant Singh, who happened to visit New York in July 1998. Of course, the 2 years of dialogue between him and Mr. Stroop Talbot, the Clinton visit to India, the Vajpayee visit to the US in 2000, the subsequent India-US nuclear deal were historic. But the 2 months of negotiations that that embassy held in the most unconventional manner marked a decisive phase in the annals of India-US relations. Another case of a serious challenge to Indian diplomacy took place in the distant islands of Fiji in 1987, when the first military coup in the South Pacific, specifically against the interests of the Indian settlers there, who formed half the population of the country and its economic backbone. Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, who had begun to count on Indians abroad for India's development, took the lead in opposing the coup tooth and nail and activated the Commonwealth to expel Fiji from it. He imposed sanctions against Fiji, which hurt the Indian community even more than the others. India refused to recognize the military regime, but chose to retain me as the High Commissioner, creating a new kind of diplomatic history. I was left to resort to my own devices to stay and support the Indian community, which would have resulted in my immediate expulsion. But the military government could not do that because of the adverse reaction of half the population and tolerated my presence. I invented my own rules of dealing with the Governor General and the officials while boycotting the coup leader and his ministers. Every diplomatic and negotiating skill I had was put to the severest test, advocating calm to the Indians, proving to the Fijians that India had no ill will towards them, and that our only wish was to restore democracy and communal harmony. But after 2 years of total uncertainty, the Fiji government gave me 72 hours to leave the country, and I left in 48 hours, saying that I shall use the remaining 24 hours to have a holiday in Fiji someday. But the skillful Indian diplomacy proved effective in restoring democracy and communal harmony in Fiji in about 10 years. Not only was our embassy returned to Suva, but I was invited to Fiji 25 years after the coup, and the former coup leader, Sitiveni Rabuka, played a round of golf with me. He said, "We were both acting under instructions then, and there is no bitterness between us," as we sipped a drink in the Suva Golf Club house. Indian diplomacy and negotiating skills helped to avert bloodshed and an exodus of Indians from Fiji. I should have focused more on multilateral diplomacy, to which most of my working life was devoted. But the remaining time may not be sufficient to do full justice to India's triumphs and tribulations in the multilateral field. India had its glorious years at the UN in the early years, basically because Pandit Nehru and his stress on global issues such as international peace, decolonization, disarmament, equitable economic development, and human rights. But our style was affected in later years by the festering issue of, within inverted commas, the India-Pakistan question in the Security Council and our refusal to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. These two developments cast a shadow on our position on other issues, such as self-determination, human rights, disarmament, and nuclear power. Even today, we have to operate in the UN without making any compromise on some of these issues. But we still continue to be an active player in the UN, and we have had many successes in various areas. That's a tribute to Indian negotiating skills in every forum, particularly in the IAEA, where I represented India for 4 years. We were skating on thin ice there most of the time, with Pakistan and Israel as our comrades in arms. I would briefly touch upon 2 instances of tough negotiations I handled in the area of human rights and climate change. Following the International Conference on Human Rights, a decision was taken to establish an Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, subject to detailed negotiations in New York. India had already expressed reservations on the proposal, but I was instructed to support it and make sure that the High Commissioner did not become too powerful. This was hard because the Western and Eastern groups were adamant, and we had to lead the non-aligned countries into diluting the mandate of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We took the chairman of the working group into confidence to say that we would facilitate the approval of the post only if his actions were subject to the decisions of the Human Rights Commission. He cooperated with us because he was himself interested in the post, and we succeeded in negotiating each paragraph successfully. I kept informing the chairman about our bottom line, but kept maintaining a maximalist position in the working group, and eventually our efforts succeeded in creating an office under the direct supervision of the Commission, and the chairman got appointed as the High Commissioner. We felt comfortable enough to invite him to Jammu and Kashmir to see the situation, and he submitted a favorable report to the General Assembly. Finally, I would like to recall my negotiating experience at COP1 on climate change in Berlin in 1995, and the memory is still fresh about COP26 in Glasgow, which you're all familiar with. After the Rio summit, we had evidence of efforts by the developed countries to renege on the Rio consensus. I had the formidable responsibilities of the leader of the official Indian delegation, the vice chairman of the conference, and the spokesman of the G77. The developed countries made a determined assault to impose mandatory cuts on major developing countries like China, India, and Brazil, and I had instructions to prevent it at any cost. The oil-producing countries and the small island states left the G77 because they wanted to push their own agenda, which differed from the G77 mandate. We were in a quandary, but I sought the support of the vast group of NGOs present in Berlin and incorporated many of their ideas into the G77 draft and presented it to the conference. The new German environment minister at that time, a name that you will all remember, Angela Merkel, was very anxious that the conference should reach consensus. And she saw no likelihood of, because of the battle between the developed countries and G77. She sought me out and asked for my cooperation. I took her into confidence and outlined our bottom line on the issue of mandatory cuts for developing countries and suggested to her to conduct discussions through shuttle diplomacy between the two groups for several nights as the debate raged in the conference house. As it often happens, she found an acceptable formula in the wee hours of the morning for the last day, and our position was protected. The concessions given to the developed countries were not substantial. Our victory was incorporated in the Kyoto Protocol, but unfortunately, the developed countries eventually rejected it. However, we succeeded in our position, and a new star was born on the German political firmament, who became a successful German chancellor in the future years. I hope you will reach appropriate conclusions on these case studies about India's negotiating style and strategy in international relations. There are many more important victories that India has won in bilateral and multilateral diplomacy. But even these give us reasons to be proud of India's negotiating style and strategy. But at the same time, we cannot close our eyes to the fact that our important initiatives to reform the Security Council and to obtain membership of the Nuclear Suppliers Group and APEC are nowhere close to fruition. I myself failed to reach a consensus when the General Assembly and the Security Council entrusted me to lead the negotiations on funding of development, UN reforms, and operation of Article 50 of the UN Charter. On the bilateral front, our diplomatic skills have not yet succeeded in reducing tensions with China and Pakistan. We have to accept that diplomacy is the art of the possible, and success eludes even the strongest and the most well-endowed of nations. But the recognition that we have received in the United Nations and world capitals is evidence of India's principled and pragmatic foreign policy, as it happened recently when India chaired the United Nations Security Council and promoted an agenda which suited our international posture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I think listening from the horse's mouth is always enriching, and I think you spoke about the reality of it. We teach the practical terms of it. They've learned distributive, integrative to all sorts of different negotiation strategies and other things. But they've also been learning on. They've understood CTBTO. We had even a mock negotiation here in the department. They've also done SALT to many others as well. Now they're doing the West Asian peace negotiations. So I think it's very enriching to listen to you. I think we'll open up the floor for the question answer session. First preference would be to the students of strategy and negotiation class, and then followed by others. Yeah, Madhuvanti. You can come here and speak. You can introduce yourself and then ask the question.
Sure.
Good morning, sir. Thank you for the insightful lecture. I'm Madhuvanti, second year master student. So my question is regarding CTBT. So in future, if India is, about enter the negotiations of CTBT, I sought to, for people who supported India to enter CTBT and, not and take the stance which we took earlier. So I just wanted to know your opinion on that. What do you?
Well, you must be remembering the words of Ambassador Arundhati Ghosh.
Yes, sir.
We will not support CTBT now or never or ever. There's a dispute as to what word she used. But the message was very clear. So we have no intention to ratify the CTBT at this particular moment.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Yeah, Shishiraj. Give him the mic. Let's see if it's audible. Sir, is he audible? Speak up. Keep it closer.
It's not working. I can't hear at all. Better to come to the mic.
Use the body.
Hello, sir. Am I audible now?
Yes, yes, and visible too.
Yeah. Sir, I am Sidhuraj, a second-year master's student at department. My question is regarding India's negotiation style. So the question is, has India's negotiation style evolved since 47? And if yes, then what are the major evolutionary trends in the overall Indian negotiation style?
Well, as I said, thank you for that question. As I said, India's position in the United Nations has evolved over the years. And therefore, the issues that come are different from those which are those. So the UN is very resilient in accepting new agenda items and bringing in new ideas. And therefore, every delegation has to rise to the occasion. And that we have done. Our own situation changed because of our position on Kashmir as well as on the. And therefore, every year, different possibilities change at the UN. Then we have adjusted ourselves to the needs of India, but basically with an approach to contribute to the common good of the world, not for our individual interests.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, sir. My name is Kiran. I'm a second year student here at the department. My question is like, we often read that the number of Indian diplomats is very limited. So what is your opinion on that? Because time and again we have read about reforms being made, taught out. There is thoughts about reforms, but the number has remained, the cadre has remained well below 1,000. How has that been impacting India's negotiating? Because we speak on one hand, we speak about aims such as Vishwaduru, and how is that? But we have a limited number of cadre. My second question is, there are allegations about discriminations against IFS officers itself, like the IFS A and IFS B, those two categories. So, is there any effect of this kind of discriminations in our negotiations? Thank you.
Well, as far as the members of the Foreign Service concerned, one of the lowest among the important countries. Even countries smaller than us has bigger representation. Not to speak of the Indian countries, superpowers, etc. I had something like 5 in Vienna. There were 5 American ambassadors in Vienna as against me. So you can imagine the constraints under which we operate. But there is a cost-benefit analysis on this. How much more do you can achieve by having 4 more ambassadors in Vienna? And that is our calculation. Where we have needed people, we have always enhanced our strength. We are operating with a shoestring budget. Defense Affairs Ministry budget is very high. But recruitment has gone under in recent years. I joined 5 or 6 people selected every year, but now we select 30 to 40 people. And our number of our missions also increased. So we are growing, but not to the extent to which the other missions, other countries are growing. But related to capacity and the cost involved in maintaining applications. As far as IFSA and it is not a discrimination at all. These are just two grades of officers. These IFSB officers write their own examination and they get promoted to IFSA after a few years. So there is no discrimination at all. These are just two grades. They are equally functional and able to serve our national interests.
Thank you, sir.
Good morning, sir. Thank you very much for the session. I'm Vasu Sharma, second year postgraduate student at the department. My question is regarding India's history and India's perception towards the role of mediator in our negotiation strategy. Because we have had two instances that of the Indus Treaty and in the Tashkent Declaration where there was a role of mediator. But after Cold War and especially in the current scenario, what is India's outlook or perception towards any role of mediator or role of any mediator in any of the upcoming negotiations which India would like to be in?
Well, Tashkent Declaration was sufficient to convince us that any mediation will be successful. In fact, Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri passed away. And that theory is that he was so pained by the decisions he made at the behest of the Soviet Union. And that left a deep impression in all of us that we should not allow ourselves to be pressurized into any action by America. And then in 1972, in Simla, India and Pakistan agreed. All future negotiations will be bilateral and nobody else will be involved. It was frequently from the US President, Secretary General of the United Nations, and all other well-intentioned people. But when you allow a mediator to come in, his effort will not be to meet your position or his position. His effort will be to see something in the middle. It will demand concessions from both sides. But since we have no concession to give in the case of Kashmir, which is an integral part of India, there is no sense involving an outsider for negotiations.
Thank you, sir.
Any other question?
Good morning, sir. I'm Gargi, second year student at the department. Thank you so much for that insightful lecture. So I have two questions for you. First, you stated that long-term foreign policy has proved hazardous for every nation. But today we are in an age where, we build strategic long-term partnerships, very evidently contradicting. So can you please elaborate why you think it's hazardous? And second question is, since negotiations aren't completely captured on camera and official papers, some happen behind the camera too, informally. So can you share few instances when India indulged in such negotiations, if at all? Thank you so much.
Well, I said that long-term plans are hazardous because of unexpected changes, cataclysmic changes which we are come across. Yes, that predicts the strategic partnership that we create with various countries. But then when the situation changes, these partnerships fall by the wayside. We have many strategic partnerships which served a particular position at that particular time. Take the Indo-Soviet Treaty, for example. It served a particular purpose at a particular time. But do we hear about it anymore? It is still there. And therefore, there has to be a flexibility. Because nobody can say that we are within a framework which was established at a particular time. It has to be flexible, and we have to seek new partnerships and the new alliances as we go along depends on the situation on the world.
Sir, one of our second year student, Ms. Rushita Shetty, has a question to you. She asks how important it is for India to still negotiate for a permanent seat in the UNSC, considering the backlash UN has been facing for its inability to act on critical issues, For example, recently we saw a delayed response by the UN with regard to Afghanistan.
Well, not only Afghanistan, I would consider the biggest the flaw or the fault of the United Nations was not to rise to the needs of the pandemic. This was the greatest existential threat that humanity faced, and China vetoed any discussion in the Security Council of this issue. And that, I think, reached the rock bottom of United Nations credibility. But then, to be convinced, you need 2/3 majority of the General Assembly and 5 permanent members unanimous to make any change in the UN Charter. And there is no formula available at this time, with all the negotiations starting in 1979, which will get this kind of situation. That is, 2/3 majority of the General Assembly and permanent members of the Security Council. So the exercise is on, consultations are on, meetings take place. There are as many proposals as members of the United Nations. And so it has not been suspended. But I do not expect any results in the near future.
Sir, our first year student, Ms. Delma, has a couple of questions for you. First one, you spoke about how you had not received any formal training regarding negotiations, and it varied on a case-to-case basis. Now, she asks, do you think such training would be required, and would it improve the capabilities of the diplomats for negotiating for the country to do a sort of formidable negotiation? That's the first question. Second question is concerning the selection of diplomats. Do you feel it has changed as compared to your days of selection? And do you think it needs reforms even now? They have already gone through certain criticisms on the Ministry of External Affairs with regard to Pillai report and how it still is valid even today. So maybe this is a question that's very pertaining to the issue of the selection and also the training that is required for the diplomats to negotiate and conduct themselves in the best possible manner in the international arena, sir.
Sure. I'm talking about my time. I joined the Foreign Service in 1967. At that time, we did not have a Foreign Service Institute. Now we have a full-fledged Foreign Service Institute, which must be training people on all aspects of the job. For example, many of the things we did in the service were not covered in the training. And of course, we had to learn most of these things ourselves. But now the situation must have changed. You have to check the current program of the Foreign Service. And selection. Well, Foreign Service always attracted top ranks from the civil service exam till very recently. And therefore, there was no question of the selection process being faulty or not getting the right kind of people. But last few years, Foreign Service has lost its arm. Many of the people who occupy the top positions in the recruitment list do not opt for the Foreign Service. In my time, if you are not in the first 10, you could join the Foreign Service. Now, even if you are within the first 150, you can get into the Foreign Service. Partly because the top people do not join the Foreign Service, partly because the number of people recruited has increased. So there are several proposals being made to have a separate examination for the Foreign Service, only to count those who give first choice for Foreign Service. But very important for the Foreign Service process to be same as the other services, because the equality that we now have in terms of service conditions, in terms of various other aspects, it is important to be part of the same exam. But like Pandit Nehru used to do, he used to interview every Foreign Service officer who came out of the examination and made sure that he was. But we have no such process, and such a process could be there. There was a proposal made by the present Prime Minister that the allocation of services should be after the training program in Moscow. That's an interesting proposal too. But the danger is that the selection may not be as transparent as it is. Because if the decision is left to the Jury Academy, then personal factors might come in, which will not happen in the UPSC. So reforms are required, but to do it.
Thank you, sir. We have another first year student, Ms. Radhika Shaw. She has a question to you. She asks, India is negotiating with China with every conflict, but it hasn't been too fruitful. So should India take any concrete stance or continue to negotiate? And would that be ever helpful in future, is her question with regard to India-China.
Well, we started in 1950, we are still going on, but there is a mechanism, and also there were several agreements. That is what we should not forget. These negotiations have not been fruitless. You know, Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China, Narasimha Rao's visit in 1993, all these made big differences in the situation on the border. Very many agreements, tranquility on the border was ensured, and so many things happened. But the problem is that China is not only not completing the negotiations in order to have the advantage of doing whatever they want to do on the line of actual control, but they also are taking the decision, taking the agreements reached. And so now we are totally on new grounds, because many of those achievements of the past have been broken by China. The actions in Ladakh has totally disregarded all these things. And therefore, it has all to start all over again. But the process is still there. There are high representatives of both the governments appointed, but the discussions are at a rather low level now because of the practical difficulties and experiences before we tackle the full issue of the border.
Thank you, sir. Our PhD student, Ms. Purnima Balasubramanian, has a question. There is a widespread perception that India is sort of a reluctant negotiator, or many times it's also called as a naysayer. You being a practitioner, in your opinion, is it true? If no, do you think such perceptions affect India's positions in the negotiations itself?
Well, not at all. We are not naysayers on everything. We have been cooperating in every negotiation that has taken place. We have tried to influence them. But we have never left, never went out of all any of these negotiations. So, of course, NPT and Kashmir are the issues on which we are being criticized. But they are fundamental to our interests. And therefore, I do not expect any kind of change because the situation changes. But otherwise, I don't think India has a reputation for saying no to everything. They are a very constructive delegation. And in fact, many years ago, when Mr. Gandhi was Prime Minister, there was a survey of effectiveness of delegations at the United Nations done by a Canadian agency. And they declared India next only to the first 5 permanent members. And that was the status we had in terms of our capability as well as ability to negotiate effectively.
Our second year student, Ms. Teresa Shaju, has a question to you. She asks, do you agree that a gender gap exists in the negotiation space? If yes, what are some ways to reduce the gender gap in negotiations?
Well, gender gap exists in many cases, but our mission in United Nations, as you see, where there is a big debate on Pakistan, it's always young ladies who answer Pakistani charges. So, in fact, there is a priority over the men to make effective interventions and to be active. And we always had at least 2 or 3 women in our mission also. So, but the gender balance is still to be achieved. Total numbers do not have as many women as men. That is a reality we must accept. But there is no discrimination, and everybody is utilized. Many of them have been posted in multilateral missions, and they have become permanent members too.
Sir, this is a question from my side. Generally, from the practical perspective, we really won't come to know how the protocol functions. And also, before going to negotiation, what are the pre-negotiation strategies that the set of diplomats who represent the country do, and who actually sets the agenda? Or what is the level of interference of the political class, or is it entirely decided by the diplomatic community in consultation with the highest office, that's the Prime Minister's office? Or how exactly this training is done in terms of, or going to a negotiation, or just prior to the negotiation, How is the preparation that is made?
Well, this has been introduced. Now, even new recruits are sent around the world, including UN offices, to get familiarity with both bilateral and multilateral negotiations. That is number one. Secondly, not everyone gets posted to multilateral posts. So whenever anyone is posted to a multilateral, whatever be the reason, the Joint Secretary, United Nations, which I was for some time, took charge of them and put them through the training program in the UN division, like others go to the other division. Those who are posted to multilateral posts are given very intensive training by the Joint Secretary, United Nations. Of course, now, but there must be, I myself went and spoke to the Foreign Service Institute and Multilateral Diplomacy. So many others will be also speaking. And there is definitely a training program being made now. My experience was that I never had a training program on multilateral diplomacy. And as about political interference, the diplomats don't make policies. We only implement them. We assist formulate policy by reporting and presenting options. And once these options are exercised by the government, instructions are given, and we follow those instructions strictly. Within, of course, the necessity of wanting to be flexible, but with continuous communication with the Ministry of External Affairs. Where we have seen some interference is when practice of sending politicians to the United Nations General Assembly comes about. Right from Pandit Nehru's days, a number of Indian parliamentarians were assigned to the General Assembly to learn parliamentary practices. Of course, it is not very wise to do that. Parliamentary practices and UN practices differ very much. So these gentlemen and ladies come there with preconceived notions that they can change the policy of the country. So embarrassing situations have happened, particularly on Afghan policy when we were supporting the Soviet Union. There were some members of parliament who said that, no, we should oppose, things like that. But that is controlled. We tell them, please speak to the Prime. We cannot argue with them. And we report the policies, and of course, 90% of the time, they go by what we tell them. But there have been a couple of instances where they try to depart from the text and speak something we should not have done. But then we have a very good method. We can go and correct that. So we have corrected the reports of some parliamentarians because that freedom delegations have. But it is not a serious problem, just aberrations.
Thank you, sir. Are there any further questions? Okay, I don't see any. Now I would request our second year student, Mr. Vasu Sharma, to propose the formal vote of thanks.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, sir, and the audience. To sum up the session, I would like to highlight 3 to 4 important pointers. First, the foundation, the brief illustration of India's foreign policy and centrality of negotiations helped us to understand a brief introduction of India's strategy. Second, the several case studies provided by Ambassador, especially the first one, that is the post-1998 negotiations and discussions in the US, had in a very precise manner illustrated that how India borrowed certain amount of power from the Indian community and the press to open communication with congressmen and other authorities, and how we depicted that sanctioning us after the 98 test would compromise the economic security of the United States. The next case studies of PG, IAEA, and COP1 were crucial to understand that how India places its principal interest and what are the different tactics and strategies we utilize to secure them. Also, the issues of permanent seat in UNSC, India's membership to NSC, and different UN reforms have prompted us and compelled us to further think on these issues and to further study what possibilities and what other strategies could India further develop to negotiate these issues? Sir, Ambassador Srinivasan, I would like to thank you for taking out time and engage with us on this particular issue, as well as engage with a lot of students on highlighting the issues of India's negotiating strategy with CTBTO, the role of mediators, and other crucial questions about India as a relevant negotiator and other things. I would also like to thank Professor Nanda Kishore to moderate this session, and Anand and Professor Anand to help us with the poster uh, and the technicalities of this session. I would also like to thank our audience for engage with you directly. And thank you very much, sir, for taking out time and to engage with us. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. We look forward to interacting with you many more times. So, on behalf of everyone here, a big thank to you too. Take care, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Bye.